Next on stage we have Brad Staples, who is CEO of APCO Worldwide. He's going to share his views on how emerging markets and globalisation is impacting communications. And I have to say, having met him 4 years ago in Portugal, he's a living example of the reality of working in a globalised industry like ours. He lives in Italy. His personal assistant's based in Paris. He works across his network of 34 offices, and he spends up to half of his year in the US. So I bet his air miles are amazing, but I should think he's exhausted. Anyway, please welcome on stage Brad Staples from APCO. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. I actually feel like a real victim of globalization right now, as you can probably detect in my voice. I've picked up one of those bugs you only get when you spend prolonged periods in an aeroplane. I think what I want to try and do with my little bit of time with you is throw the net a little wider, look at the world and the world that we're in from the outside in. My challenge is to help us try to understand a little better what globalization means for companies, agencies, for communicators wherever they sit. And to do that, I thought what I'd do is dig a little deeper into the layers of what has driven globalization, how it's defined by action and inaction on the part of a host of different entities, from government through companies and others, and then talk a little bit about how it relates to us. So I think we need to begin by rethinking what impact means. Globalization and digitization in combination has profoundly redefined our world. I was thinking what would be the moment in recent history that really defines that moment. And I think it's when a young market trader in a small market town in Tunisia, after many years of sustained oppression from the municipal authorities that managed his small stall, the bullying, the humiliation, turned to a quite extraordinary act and set fire to himself to demonstrate the sheer frustration that he had. That act, that extreme act, caught the attention of the entire population in Tunisia. It led the president to go to his bedside just prior to his death. Ultimately, the act led to that president being deposed. The pace and the nature of engagement in social media that came following Mohamed Bouaziz's act is quite extraordinary. In Egypt alone, where political messages on tweets on a daily basis used to appear around 2,300, 2,500 a day, just before the president in Egypt, Hosni Mubarak, was deposed, were up around 250,000 a day. Globalization and the nature of digital communications is something that we're just beginning to get to grips with. Most recently, the decision in the European Court of Justice on Tuesday to remove the safe harbor provisions that relate to the wholesale communication of data from Europe to US, the backbone of the transatlantic digital economy, those provisions were removed with enormous cost implications for large US IT giants. That came about, that extraordinary, very significant economic challenge for businesses in the digital space came about because one young man in Austria a few years ago, while doing postgraduate studies in Santa Clara in California, was upset and irritated by a Facebook presentation about how they were able to circumvent data privacy rules. His campaign from his bedroom led to this result this week, with a host of other actors and other participants coming on board. It is profound, it is significant, and frankly, it's something that was seen to be emerging and occurring for a very long period of time. And when you look at the combined resources of those US tech giants, their inability to grapple with and avoid that outcome, it's quite extraordinary. Those driving impact in a globalized world are very different. And if you look at the extraordinary volatility and the scale of unpredictability in our world today, it's accelerating. These are just a series of events that took place this year, that are taking place this year. In the summer, we saw 40% of the value of Chinese stocks wiped off the stock market within 3 weeks. We saw an outsider who put himself forward for the Republican nomination with no political background and a rather unorthodox business background rise to the top of the polls amongst those that are eligible to vote to over 20%. And Donald Trump is still, for how long we don't know, but still there at the top of those rankings. When the Chinese decided that enough was enough with the World Bank and its inability to invest in the way they wanted to see it invest in infrastructure projects in emerging markets, they established the Asia Investment and Infrastructure Bank, and 57 countries around the world signed up on day one to participate in that. That's a profound shift. That is a move away from the Washington Consensus, the World Bank model of investing and building in emerging markets. Some leaders in business and in politics are keeping pace with these changes and doing well. Many are not. The lackluster former Australian Prime Minister is a good example of one of those who didn't keep pace with this change. His very narrow vision of globalization being principally about selling large quantities of minerals to a Chinese market growing at 10% year on year proved to be short-sighted. His social conservatism proved to be out of step with a world in which 62% of Irish voters supported gay marriage earlier this year, and five out of the judges in the Supreme Court supported exactly the same issue. So here's an example of a leader who failed to appreciate both the economic and the political dynamics that are taking place and happening around us. In this country, Beppe Grillo and the Five Star Movement were part of the first wave of a new form of protest politics that have redefined the nature of parties in Europe. Jeremy Corbyn, recently appointed or elected as the leader of Her Majesty's opposition in the UK, is another part of that story. All of these are extraordinary events that we would not have anticipated, perhaps couldn't have even seen on the radar just a year ago. If we go back in time, there's a new reality of self-reinforcing interdependence that's created this globalized world. The hotel that you see on the left there is the one in which the Bretton Woods conference took place in '44. It created the financial context in which we've had peaceful growth and global capital available in the post-war period. Those multinational agencies, however, have failed to keep pace with the nature of globalization and change. We've got global capital, but we now also have a new wireframe for globalization, and it's built on air transport, enhanced shipping and communications around the world, and an IT infrastructure that allows for real-time communications globally. But we're only at the beginning of this journey. What you see in the map here is an illustration, a heat map of the number of global devices connected to the internet now. All mobile, all devices. And a quarter of the world's population in Asia is in darkness. It's underserved entirely. As that begins to change and that heat map gets brighter across the world, we'll see a profoundly different context in which we're working and in which we're communicating. There is, however, some counter movements that are creating big challenges and are going to challenge our clients and challenge our own organizations. There is an increasing global gridlock. Those multinational agencies, the UN groups in particular, are really struggling to keep pace with change, as I've mentioned before. We also have a countercurrent of GDP decline globally. GDP globally is not where we anticipated and foresaw it to be, both in emerging nations and in the West. And the decline you see here is the IMF's latest numbers of just this week. So we have essentially a deficit of global governance, a deficit of global leadership, and something is going to fill it, and it's starting to fill it. And I'll talk a little bit about what that is. It's not the G20. The G20 is a representation of the vacuum that there is in leadership worldwide. This is not a group that takes decisions. It's a physical manifestation of the inability of multilateral agencies to drive change and get decisions taken. We're finding now more and more that strong leaders around the world are filling this gap, whether it's Shinzo Abe in Japan or it's Xi Jinping in China or Jokowi in Indonesia. They're creating their own models and their own ways of defining and building their economies. Sorry, I've got to keep pace with my slides. That's them. There you go. And so, beyond government leaders, we have companies increasingly being called on to fill the gaps. And some corporate leaders are grappling with this opportunity and seizing the chance to engage in a globalized world. And they're redefining their businesses, they're redefining their brands, and they're driving their own personal reputations. Paul Polmans was mentioned earlier from Unilever, who's definitely amongst that group. But you might include Tim Cook. You probably would include Muhtar Kent at Coca-Cola or Howard Schwartz at Starbucks. But in a world where there is very little trust, it's extraordinary that this millennial generation looks more to business, to corporations, and to brands to represent their values and their aspirations than they do to politicians. That's a challenge to us. It's an opportunity, but it's also a significant challenge. It's impossible to have this conversation without focusing on China for a little bit, so I thought I would do that for a moment. The world has become very used to Chinese growth at over 10% year on year. And economies became a little too comfortable with this situation. The Australian example that I mentioned before is a good example of that. With the decline in growth in China, now down to about 6.3%, we see that the world is having to rethink globalization and what that footprint looks like. In China as well, we've got a new clampdown on corruption, which is impacting international investors, large corporations in the country. Understanding where that journey will take us, you probably have to be Xi Jinping to know that, because very few others have a real insight into what that plan is and where we will end up. I think if you take a moment, though, and just think a little bit about growth in China, in 2008, when they had the Olympics, their economy was half the size that it is today. We've got a China that also has the confidence to define global rules. The map here is that representation of all the countries that joined the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank when it was launched. On the other side, you see the anti-monopoly crackdown that's being driven in China, affecting every sector from LCD panels to milk powder and insurance. And these are real challenges for our clients as they enter that market. But this is just one of the many actors that is impacting this new multipolar world. An investment bank came up with the notion of the BRICS countries. It was a flawed concept in many ways and has proven to be flawed by the economic output of those countries in recent years. But it represents a group of countries who want a bigger say. And there are others that want a bigger say. The MICTA countries, as you may have heard of, Australia and Indonesia, Mexico, South Korea, Turkey, they represent another of those groupings that is looking for a place in the world, a voice in the world beyond the structures that we have at the moment. TPP and TTIP, the two trade discussions that are taking place transatlantically and transpacifically, they're part of this as well. That is an attempt of Western nations to club together and ensure some control over the global economy as China begins to insert itself more and more. But it's not just governments and it's not just companies that are defining our world in a globalized context. There are many others that are adapting to and moving faster and in a more impactful way in a globalized environment. That includes the NGOs, shareholder activists, ISIS, perhaps, emerging multinationals from new countries on the global stage, cybercrime, those looking to undermine the effectiveness and the structure of a digital economy, the blogging and online community, and also increasingly high net worth individuals and philanthropists who are looking to assert a real meaningful impact on a whole host of issues, from global health to climate change and other questions. These are now the global players in terms of shaping the communications environment. When we look at the companies that are going to be leaders in the globalized world in the middle of this century, it's going to be a very different picture. Every indication suggests that the Fortune 500 will be made up of 50% companies from China, India, and the other emerging nations. It's quite a significant and quite extraordinary, profound change. So that's the table that represents where we're headed in terms of the Fortune 500. In this context, we can't forget what's happening in terms of the megacities. Some of them are weaving their way through this uncertainty and defining a very clear path for themselves and being extraordinarily successful. Dubai is the best example of that. It's become a global financial center. It's become a global transportation hub. It's the place in which a quarter of the world's cranes reside as they build buildings higher and higher. And it's a place where 80% of the population is international. It's one of several global cities that are redefining both the economic and political landscape worldwide. And it's not just a country or a city change. This is on a continental scale. We had a wonderful panel earlier on talking about Africa and how these countries are rising and beating and exceeding all expectations. This is set to continue for some time. The Nigerian population will be bigger than that of the United States by 2050. It proved to have very strong growth last year, 6.5% growth last year, and and Africa overall, sub-Saharan Africa, will be at 5.4% growth in the course of this year. It's extraordinary, the pace and the nature of change. And it's a very, very different communications environment for us and for our clients going forward. There's economic progress, enormous success alongside poverty, large-scale unemployment, education and health challenges, which demand that companies assume responsibility and engage on all of those issues. This is an interesting view from Asian-based corporate leaders of the extent to which they're listened to by headquarters in the US or in Europe. And it's a universal picture. Essentially, they feel that their perspectives and their insights are not accounted for. They're not listened to. The cultural nuances, the sensitivities, and the challenges of operating in Asia are not fully appreciated by headquarters. So these global companies, although they have joined up structures in many respects, are not using the assets and the insights of their people around the world to shape their communications. So this new reality is transforming our industry. Without any question, we're seeing enormous change. So what's our role in this? I think first and foremost, and it's been touched on earlier in the day, we need to have far greater predictive capability. We have colossal resources at our disposal. The new big data tools that we have, and I'll come on and show you some of the ways we're using them, give us an ability to, in a very micro way, segment, differentiate the global community and work out how to deliver with real precision our messages, whether it's earned paid media or it's new channels. We need to harness opinion research in a way that we've not done before. Looking across all of our competitors, we noted that many have invested in the last 2 years in opinion research. Sophisticated opinion research coupled with big data, resources, predictive analytics, provides a whole pool of resources for communications. But it needs to be alongside cultural intelligence, and it needs to be with those predictive and monitoring capabilities all together. Essentially, we need to begin to think and behave in the way that management consultancies do so well. Not only in productizing our offer, but in the way but thinking in a structured way and doing it at a much faster pace to keep up to date with the activists, the bloggers, and the protesters. Business structures designed to help embrace and navigate global change are essential. Part of our repertoire has to be to guide our clients on the organizational design of their companies to have the greatest impact in a communications context. We need to have that confidence. We need to embrace that challenge. When the board is not aligned on a global vision, when the strategy department is decoupled from the external relations or communications team, if the outside resources of external counsel and an advisory group are not harnessed and used in an effective way, it has a massive impact. We need to have the confidence to guide our clients on how they engage in that way. When we look at some of the big data tools that are available to us, we have a new opportunity that we've never seen before to understand the stakeholder landscape with a degree of precision that never before existed. This magnifying glass represents an assessment we did for a branded goods client in the US that wanted to segregate and differentiate and appreciate the different elements that make up the millennial community that they're trying to reach. Each dot represents a person, each line represents a link between them. Using one of those tools, we were able to differentiate groups on the basis of who they communicate with, who they are connected to, not on the basis of what they are necessarily saying. This analysis enabled us to go deeper than looking at the output on social media, but actually look at who people are connected to, and therefore the relationships that they have. Those relationships are clearly far more durable and long-standing than what you see if only looking at output from certain social media activists. And when we applied that to our client, we were able to find some very clear, distinguishable groups who embrace certain aspects of what it is that they do and they stand for, segregate them, look at who they are, and look at where they live. And it's proved to be a truly valuable tool in understanding this globalized, connected community. And if you read the slide quick enough, you'll spot who the client is. I think we date ourselves when we see digital as an add-on. And I still hear it a little bit in the room, and it's something we have to move away from. It's crucial that we all appreciate that social media is more than just another channel. It's not just another place to broadcast messages. It's a fundamental shift in the way people communicate and relate to each other. And the true power in communications is having the ability to harness that, to understand and appreciate those connections and seize the opportunities that we have with that data. We've also got to look at brands, and we do a disservice to our clients when we think that simply meeting expectations is good enough. It's clearly not. This image represents the champion brand model we developed at APCO, which really helps to differentiate between those companies that forge a relationship, a durable, long-standing relationship with their stakeholders, and those that don't. Succeeding in this globalized world means you have to find those attachments to your stakeholders. You have to create a level of authenticity and ensure it's sustained in terms of communications, but also forge a deep attachment and ultimately become an advocate for their aspirations, for their values, and for their hopes for the future. The best brands do this. And our research that we put out every year illustrates it year on year in terms of which are the strongest in this regard. So thinking globally is part of it, but it's not enough. Companies also need to align globally. And going back to that notion of organizational design, we have to have the confidence and we need to be robust in giving advice to our clients. We need to globalize the expertise of communicators. We need to make sure that our own organizations enable a free flow of information for people to spend time in different locations, to join up and have a world view as well as a sensitized local view, and be able to apply that to the work that they do. We need to tear down those barriers to effective collaboration. I think we also have to recognize the extraordinary power of internal communications. I think many firms are looking more and more at that capability and developing and enhancing it, because in such an interconnected world, it's a colossal opportunity for all of us. And I think where a common culture can be created, there's a clear vision and a joined-up approach between communicators around the world, the impacts are disproportionately greater. So we need to maintain our relevance. That means we need to have the ability to assemble asymmetrical and unorthodox alliances to enable our clients to partner with and connect to this new stakeholder community. Reset our threshold for purpose-led commercial activity. The bar is now much, much higher. The level of scrutiny is now much greater. The rapid response from those that see through a superficial engagement in this respect happens at lightning speed. So we need to forge those ties with empowered activists and accelerate the speed of information to market across the board if we're to operate in this environment. So starting now, we have to recruit, I think, from that community. Go out and find those people who are activists, who are engaged, who know and understand and already operate in that space, bring them into our organizations, learn from their capabilities, and have the confidence to give bold advice to our clients. Working outside of the brief, challenging them to look at the world through a different lens and to understand these challenges and the opportunities that are created, even though the world has become far more complex. We need that storytelling capability, those visual communications that have that impact others have spoken about earlier on today, that appeal both at an intellectual and an emotional level to the things that we're saying. And be confident about giving counsel so that our clients think of us as those that can help them drive their reputation, organize their business for success, as well as producing messages. In essence, we need to matter.